we're going to come back in just a moment's time and have another caller. It's going to be Leyland in Canada, as he asks, is there enough evidence beyond the Gospels to make its testimony reliable? You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley. My special guest today is J. Warner Wallace, author of Cold Case Christianity. You want to find out more about him? Why not go to the the webpage of Unbelievable, where you can find links. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Well, it's a pleasure to have now Leland, who's coming in from Canada, on the line as we go to our next question to Jim, our cold case detective from California. Leland, thank you for being with me. I know you've been listening to the show for a little while, haven't you?
Yes, I have been, for a few years now.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Do you want to just give us a brief idea of your background? You're an atheist, essentially. Was that way you describe yourself?
Essentially, yeah. I'm an atheist. I come from, actually, my family has sort of been a-religious growing up, so I didn't grow up going to a church or anything like that, although I did have friends who went to church. And so, yeah, I was sort of left to my own devices to sort of build a worldview from scratch.
That worldview, obviously, has not brought you to Christianity, but you're obviously interested, and I'm so glad that you've take the opportunity to listen via the podcast, and I know we've been in touch one way or another on Twitter and Facebook and email over the years.
For sure.
Do you want to just lay out your question, though, for Jim today, and then we'll have some time for back and forth as he answers it?
Well, essentially, it's is there enough evidence beyond the Gospels to make the testimony of the Gospels reliable? Because otherwise, it's essentially a circular argument, right? That's
a really interesting case. I mean, I don't know, Jim, whether this corresponds to the chapter in the book called "Were They Corroborated?" Would that be a sort of general area of evidential technique?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a very fair statement and a very fair concern, and it's a concern that really was one of my primary concerns as somebody looking at the Gospels from the outside in, is that I wanted to know. This is the second level we talk about. Are they there to begin with? Were they really present? Secondly, can they be verified or corroborated in some way? Third, have they changed their story over time? And fourth, are they biased? So there's a little bit about bias, I think, here, and a little bit about corroboration that needs to be talked about. And I don't want to take up all the time here, but Leland, let me just tell you how I approached it. One thing I learned early on when talking about corroborative evidence is that all corroborative evidence is what I call touch point evidence. Here's what I mean. If a witness says, yeah, I saw this guy go in the bank, he got up on the counter, put his left hand on the counter and took out with his right hand a pistol and pointed at the clerk and said, give me all your money, then I would want to corroborate that statement somehow. And one way I might corroborate that is to go back after the fact and look and see on that counter where she said he put his left hand, do I have a palm print in the direction it ought to be in order to corroborate what she said? And if I find there's a palm print, I would consider that, and if I brought it into a court of law, we would consider that to be corroborative evidence. But interestingly, you'll note that the presence of the palm print tells us nothing about whether or not the suspect had a gun, nothing about what he said. As a matter of fact, it gives us a very small touch point related to the entire eyewitness statement. And this is always the nature of corroborative evidence, short of, I do occasionally have videotape on, or digital video on some of these cases, but not very often. So I've got to corroborate on what I call touch point evidence. So when looking at this larger narrative in the scriptures, I got to remember, although I have a very high regard for corroborative evidence, I also have a low expectation for what percentage of the total narrative I'm going to be able to corroborate. And so this is what I see happening when I look at the Gospels. I think there is a significant amount of corroboration outside, but every piece, of course, gets challenged by some skeptic who doesn't want to embrace the writings of Tacitus or Thallus or Marbar Serapeon or, Phlegon, whoever it is you may bring up, whatever ancient witness you might bring from outside who has something to say about Jesus. I typically would have I found some way to wiggle out of that statement. But what's interesting about making this corroborative effort is that it's substantive. In other words, there's a lot of stuff outside of Scripture And even inside of Scripture, when the authors describe something accurately, like Luke's accurate description of some of the rules of government that he describes in Acts, for example. Norm Geisler's done a lot of work just on that one area. Or the inclusion of minor villages, minor cities in the Gospels that you don't see ever included in the non-canonical Gospels. The later forgeries are lucky if they include the cities they know, like Jerusalem, but they're unfamiliar largely with the minor cities that are mentioned in the Gospels. I mean, there are reasons both internally and externally. And let me just leave you with one last thought on that before you respond. And that's that typically when I get into a trial and I build a circumstantial case against a defendant, what ends up happening is a number of evidences exist that point and are most reasonably inferred as pointing to the suspect as guilty. And you could argue, man, this guy's just really either incredibly unlucky that there are dozens of pieces of evidence that just coincidentally make him appear to be guilty, or he's just guilty. And this is why he is the one unifying element in all these evidences. And I think in a similar way, the Christian narrative is either incredibly lucky because there happen to be a ton of these touch point corroborations, both from outside sources and also in different lines of investigation, both internally and externally, and they just happen to make the story look like it's true, or they're just unified by the fact the story is true. So I think this is kind of the same approach I take when I look at the nature of corroborative evidence.
Leland, what's your main concern here? Is it that there simply isn't enough corroborative evidence outside sources apart from the Gospels to make us trust the Gospels? And do you want to just give us a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, well, that's basically, foundationally, yeah, that's where I come from. I would like to respond to a couple of points.
Sure. Go ahead.
One, in your bank robber example, the real benefit that we have is that you could, in that situation, go into the bank and look for an actual physical palm print. So your proximity in time to the event allows you to do that sort of thing. Many of the Gospels, I think most scholars believe or will agree with, many of the Gospels were written decades after the fact. And so that separation in time sort of takes you away from being able to say, well, this definitely happened, because you don't have that immediate access to the evidence. Another thing you point out is the existence of minutiae, like the names of towns and things like that. And the problem I have with that is, I mean, you could look at things like Spider-Man comic books or Harry Potter that both are set in ostensibly real locations. But if I go to New York, I'm not going to be looking out for, a guy walking on the walls who can lift cars. So, I mean, those are some valid points. But, and I just one other thing I'd like to allude to is in a recent paper by Stephen Law, he mentioned something called a contamination principle, which essentially is when a testimony or a document has a narrative that combines both mundane claims and a significant proportion of extraordinary claims. There's a very good reason to be skeptical about the extraordinary claims and also about the mundane claims that surround them.
Okay. That's it. There were 3 points there to potentially respond to, Jim. Take your pick. Maybe first of all, distance from the event. You can go in and check that palm print in front of you.
Sure.
You don't have these events in front of you, and we don't know exactly how long after the fact some of the Gospels were written down.
Okay, a couple of things about that. I know we're actually short on time here, but my cases are never the day after the event. My cases are decades following the actual event, and I've been able to go back and find pieces of physical evidence on occasion that support an eyewitness testimony. I think we do something very, very similar when we look at archaeological evidence. Now, I can tell you a lot of folks want to reject the depth of archaeological evidence, but remember, archaeological evidence is probably the premier example of touch point evidence. It's what I have not termed it this, but I quote somebody in my book who does. It's a discipline of fractions. Only a fraction of sites have been discovered. Only a fraction of those sites have been excavated. Only a fraction of those sites are even biblical. So we have to look at the fraction approach to archaeology. I think the case we have to support circumstantially the reliability of this issue of corroboration is pretty deep in this sense. It involves not only archaeological confirmations we see, It involves the statements of non-Christians in antiquity, both Jewish and pagan. It involves also the corroboration of internal evidence, as we see in terms of accurate descriptions of government structure, accurate descriptions of locations, accurate use of language, even the accurate use of personal pronouns, proper names rather, that are used in the region in this time period. So you see there's lots, so my whole point is that what level of corroboration would we expect? To me, it really is the rub, is that I think that for most of us, like you just said a second ago, Leland, the idea here is this includes elements of the supernatural. If I could take all those elements of the supernatural out of the account, and I just presented to you Jesus, the smart guy from 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't have any hesitancy at all at accepting the account as historically reliable, even as corroboration. The problem is that these include I wouldn't have, let's put it that way. I'll just speak personally. My issue with it was I came from a position of philosophical naturalism, and I rejected the existence of anything supernatural. So in other words, I would have considered those the extraordinary claims you were talking about. I am not suggesting we take the Gospels at their face, but I am suggesting this. We seem to be biased against the Gospels as history for some reason. We say, hey, you can't trust these accounts because they were written by Christians, and Christians are therefore biased. But this is just, I give an example of this in the book. If I see a robbery, and I had a case like this that actually occurred, in which somebody came in and did a robbery, and the witness was shocked because she knew this guy from high school, and she could not believe that he'd be the kind of person who'd even commit a robbery. And after it was over, when we interviewed her, she said, couldn't believe my eyes. Now, the question is, should I trust her at all as a reliable witness? After all, she's convinced that this guy, let's call him Mark Hill, was a robber. He might even say she's a Mark Hillian. But we would say, no, of course not. She's not convinced because she held a pre-existing bias. She's convinced because she watched this guy do a robbery. And the same thing, I think, is happening with the authors of Scripture. They don't begin with this bias toward Jesus. They want to write him out as this guy he's not. They end up convinced over a period of time on the basis of observation. And that's a very different, I think, situation.
We're going to go to a quick break, and then I'll let you come back again, Leland. So we're talking about the evidence for Christianity, the evidence specifically for the Gospels, and helping us through that is J. Warner Wallace, the author of Cold Case Christianity, bringing the same techniques he uses as a homicide detective to investigate cold cases from decades ago to the issue of whether we can trust the events of the Gospels. We'll let our caller, Leland in Canada, respond in just a moment's time as we ask this question of whether there's corroborative evidence beyond the Gospels, and the internal evidence of the Gospels as well is what we've moved on to as well. Well, so just to continue and to complete really our conversation, let's just hear your response, Leland, to what we were hearing from Jim there. Essentially, he's saying, you talk about bias, maybe you've got a bias as well, in the sense that you're not willing to be open to the supernatural. You think, therefore, that clouds the whole of the testimony of the Gospels, because people who would write that stuff maybe can't be trusted with the historical details as well. Is that fair? I don't know.
That's not actually my point. My point, if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that the existence of the supernatural elements in the book taints or contaminates any potential veracity of the mundane events. So sure, I'm sure they got the names of the towns and the names of the people and things like that correct, but the fact that it's all part and parcel of a document or collection of documents that contains a fairly substantial percentage of supernatural elements, it forces, you can't say, well, because there are mundane elements there, the supernatural elements must be true, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
Right, okay, yeah. Jim, do you want to just respond on that?
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's where I stood for many years. Here's my problem, though, with that. It's the first chapter of the book, is the first tool you have to have. I can't walk into a crime scene and decide on the basis of the nature of the crime scene. Say it looks to me like it's a domestic violence homicide. Well, that's sure it's a possibility, but I cannot let my preconception, I cannot let that kind of put the guard up or the rails up to limit my investigation. And here's what my problem with this approach is. As a non-believer, I had a presupposition about naturalism that provided me with the definition of what I would accept before I even started. So I already, by definition, excluded anything supernatural. And if the investigation under consideration here is, does something supernatural, God, exist? I can't begin from the position that if it's a supernatural element, it doesn't even belong in the narrative. It's not historical. It's purely mythology. I have started with a decision about the suspect before I even looked at the evidence related to the suspect. So instead, I have to kind of step back and let's just. It seems then that the least thing you're going to come to is this, Leland, that the document is reliable about everything it says except for the supernatural. And that's, I think, where a lot of us end up. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, so what is it that's stopping me from taking this step? Is it evidence about the supernatural or a presupposition about the supernatural?
Do you have a presupposition then that's kind of making you weigh the other evidence in the balance of it?
I don't think I do, but I think I operate more from a case of I've been on the planet for 40 years. And I've never seen anything supernatural myself. I've never seen any evidence of any other, verifiable supernatural events happening in my 40 years on the planet. If you go back, there's not a lot of evidence for anything even before I was here. So I'm operating on an assumption of if 99.9999999% of history contains no verifiable supernatural events, I'm operating from the preponderance of the evidence, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Okay, Jim.
Well, for me, it's a matter of not preponderance. It's a matter of reasonable, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so what happens here, it seems to me, is that we begin, and I do think in some ways, Leland, if you listen to your words in the last question, you begin with this idea that if a supernatural is there, it cannot be trusted. And I understand that a lot of it is from our personal experience. But it's interesting to me that we take this view related to issues of faith, or issues of Christianity especially, and we say, hey, if I can't believe anything that I can't see with my own eyes. I can't believe anything, for example, I can't discover with science. When in fact, that position you hold is something you can't see with your own eyes and can't discover with science. You're applying a standard to this, which you really don't apply to any other aspect of your life. The vast majority of information you hold in your head is not through experience. The vast majority of information you hold in your head is through the teaching of somebody else who gave it to you. You took it on the authority of somebody. So for me, I want to look at these accounts and say, do I have good reason to believe they are authoritative in some way or they are reliable in some way? And of course, there are claims, many claims of history that include supernatural elements. You might say, well, they're a small percentage, but it turns out this example, this claim of history that includes supernatural elements seems to have been one of the most significant claims in all of history. It seems to have changed the culture and set our trajectory for 2,000 years. So I think we got to really assess it in terms of its reliability rather than how frequently. Let me tell you, I work cold cases. These kinds of cases don't happen all that often. They are extremely rare in our state. That's why people get away with them for so many years. But the rarity of the case does not preclude me from beginning an investigation. That's just the nature of these kinds of investigations. And it does not preclude the existence of a true killer. So I have to kind of look at that one issue with a little bit of skepticism too.
We are going to have to start to draw things to a close. Leland, I'm sure there's much more you'd want to say in response, and the time always beats us with this. But really appreciate you being on the show and being bold enough to come on and do the discussion and everything. So thank you for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Great to have you, Leland. Hope you enjoy continuing to listen to Unbelievable. Very interesting sort of two very different callers there. I'm sure you'd agree, Jim.
Yes.
But both, of course, coming sort of from the point of view of can we trust these Gospels? I think probably different issues, as we've heard, that have been behind all this. The big issue, I suppose, for me is that it seems like, as you bring these issues of comparing it to crime cases and what you would present in the court of law and so on, and ask, what you seem to have said in the course of the programme, Jim, is that even though there are discrepancies that a jury may have to take into account, a jury is looking for a kind of a bigger picture of reliability on the part of a witness. And I guess the point is that for many atheists who perhaps want every single issue addressed and cleaned up, well, you're never going to get there, because you wouldn't get that in a crime case either. You're going to have to accept that there's going to be some areas where there's a sort of certain area of not quite sure exactly how that pans out, because you're looking at the bigger case that people are ultimately going to make their decision on. Is that making any sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I'll tell you something. I will start blogging on some of these specifics at coldcasechristianity.com, so you can kind of see what the traditional Christian response has been. But I think the overarching principle is actually more important than the one you just mentioned, Justin. I just did a case that was on Dateline in March, in which a man murdered his wife 30 years ago, got rid of her body, and claimed that she ran off. And we had many unanswered questions. How did he kill her? Where did he kill her? What did he do with her body? How did he move her car to make it look like she was still alive? Could not answer any of those. They remained unanswered questions as the jury came to a 4.5-hour decision about his guilt, and a month later, he confessed to all of it. So I think we have to remember, when we start cases like this, there will always be unanswered questions. This does not mean there is an irreconcilable difference or a discrepancy that cannot be reconciled through history. It means that we don't have the means available to us at the point of making a decision to reconcile that difference. And that may often be the case now. As an atheist, I didn't have the way to reconcile, all the beginning of matter from non-matter, all those kinds of issues, the beginning of the universe, yet I was willing to step out in this direction in spite of those unanswered questions. So we all do it. I just think here we have to kind of apply the same courtesy, the same grace to the narrative in Scripture.
It's fascinating stuff. You've been blogging. You do a lot of blogging, actually. You've mentioned already coldcasechristianity.com is where people can go to find out more. And you're going to be picking up, I know, some of the issues we've raised already in the program there. So do check out the blog if you want to maybe delve a little bit deeper into some of Jim's responses to some of the issues that came up earlier with Rob around the dating of Jesus' birth and how that fits with John and his timeline and so on, and indeed what we've been talking about with Leland. Coldcasechristianity.com. I guess what for me is interesting in the end is this idea of I think there's a term for this, isn't there, which is essentially beyond reasonable doubt. That's what a jury in the end is asked to judge a case on, right?
Absolutely. That's the highest standard we have, Justin, in court. That's the highest standard.
And you'd apply the same principle to assessing the case for Christianity, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what we say is important in a criminal case in which we're going to decide the fate of a defendant, is he going to live, is he going to die, is he going to spend the rest of his life in jail? We use a standard which is really the highest standard available to us in criminal trials here in America, the reasonable doubt standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not beyond any possible doubt. It's beyond reasonable doubt. And these are the doubts that I think are raised evidentially. And so I think what we do is we say, if that standard is good enough for the temporal future of human beings on this planet, whether they live or die or spend the rest of their life in jail, it ought to be a standard that's good enough for us to judge our eternal fate, our eternal lives. And so I think we can use the standard of reasonable doubt when assessing the Gospels as well. And that's the approach at least I took as a skeptic coming in. And when it really came down to it, Justin, it came down to this. I was still rejecting the Scriptures, rejecting what the Bible taught, not on the basis of the evidence available to me, but on the basis of what I wanted the evidence to tell me. It was an issue not so much that was based in rational rejection of evidence, but in volitional rejection of this entire worldview. And so I had to really assess, what is it? Am I starting off with a presuppositional bias that eliminated me from seeing the proper suspect in this case, or the proper conclusion of this investigation? And I think once I realized that it was really more me determining my view of the evidence than it was the evidence determining the view of the evidence, it was time to make a change.
Well, it's been a fascinating show and really interesting to hear your personal story alongside it as well, Jim. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. If you want to find out more about the book, well, a good place to start is, of course, as I mentioned, Jim's website there, coldcasechristianity.com. It is really fascinating. I've really enjoyed reading it just because not only do you get, obviously, a good grounding in the case for the Gospels, you also just find out all kinds of fascinating things about homicide detective work as well along the way. So highly recommended by me and many others as well. It's certainly been making quite a lot of interest in apologetic circles and hopefully beyond as well. Jim Warner Wallace, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for having me. It was quite an honor and a privilege.
Thank you for listening as well. If you want to respond to anything you've heard on today's program, well, I'll be